This happened when I was staying in a school hostel. I was around 12 years old at the time. I studied at a Roman Catholic school, known for its strict discipline and religious traditions. The school itself was in a very remote area, surrounded on all sides by thick jungle. Within the compound stood a towering cathedral, and right beside it, a massive graveyard. You can imagine, growing up there, ghost stories and experiences were part of our daily life. Strange sounds, unexplained shadows, and eerie whispers at night. I will be narrating 3 haunting stories which happened in that school. The first story comes from the experience our school guards. The school had 3 night guards who stayed on the property. They were given a small room just across the football ground. Unlike the day guards, these men lived inside the compound, and from time to time, they would share stories of strange noises, unseen footsteps, and a heavy presence that followed them through the night. Some of us believed the stories, while a small bunch of us thought these were just stories, too good to be true. The most unsettling part was that, even near the chapel, the holiest place on campus, the ghostly presence felt the strongest. One morning, chaos erupted near our hostel. The guards were arguing heatedly with the principal. From what we overheard, they wanted to quit their jobs immediately. The principal refused, insisting they finish their contract. But the guards were terrified. They claimed they had almost lost their lives the night before. This is what happened. Around midnight, one of the guards named Jackson heard noises coming from the jungle. Something unusual, since the guards were more accustomed to whispers or faint singing in the distance. At first, Jackson thought it might be a wild animal. He flashed his torch into the trees, but saw nothing. Shrugging it off, he went back. But then, the sound came again. This time it wasn't an animal. It was a voice, a deep, guttural voice, calling for help. Despite his fear, duty pushed him forward. Jackson followed the sound into the darkness, and for a brief moment, his light caught something crawling rapidly between the trees. Panicked, he fired his rifle into the night, thinking it might be a wild animal. Silence followed, and then, whispering, he swung his torch again, and froze. A face stared back at him, bald, with no eyebrows, no nose, and glowing red eyes. The creature crouched, motionless, watching him. Terrified, Jackson aimed his rifle. But before he could pull the trigger, the face appeared right in front of him, inches away. The thing grabbed his face and let out a monstrous growl. Jackson was paralyzed with fear. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. But instinctively, his hand touched the small Bible in his pocket, which he carried with him everywhere he went. The moment he did, the creature vanished, hurling him violently to the ground. Peter, the other guard who was close by, rushed to him and found him unconscious, with deep scratches across his face and a broken arm. When Jackson finally woke up, he refused to speak. He just sat quietly, clutching his Bible, and prayed. Later that night, Jackson told his friend, Peter, what had happened in accurate detail. Both of them, struck with fear, sat in silence, staring at each other. The third guard, named Daniel, posted at the far end of the school, had his own terrifying encounter that same night. He rushed into the room, pale and trembling, only to find his 2 friends, Jackson and Peter, already sitting in silence, faces drained of life, as if their very souls had been stolen. While on duty, Daniel had first heard footsteps creeping up from behind. Spinning around, he checked behind him but saw no one. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, until the sound came again, closer this time. Then, without warning, a chilling whisper brushed against his ear. The demon is coming to feast on your soul. At this moment, Daniel froze in terror. His torchlight revealed nothing, yet strange noises stirred from the woods. For a fleeting moment, he caught sight of a figure draped in white, floating unnaturally toward him. Daniel shone his light directly at it, but the figure vanished. Moments later, a guttural growl rumbled above him from the forest. When he lifted the torch, his blood ran cold. The same grotesque, noseless face his fellow guard, Jackson, had seen, stared back at him with glowing red eyes. It roared, then dissolved into the darkness. Overcome with terror, the guard fled, every step haunted by the feeling of something chasing him. Later that night, the three guards finally shared their horrifying encounters. Shaken beyond reason, they made their decision. None of them would ever work there again. The very next day, they quit. We could see Jackson had visible burnt mark resembling that of a finger on his face. We also could see that Peter and Daniel were pale and visibly shaken to the core. Of course, the principal dismissed the whole thing as superstition, claiming the guards had simply fabricated the story to leave early with full pay. But we students knew better. Even the new guards who replaced them soon reported strange events, though not as terrifying as what the three guards experienced. From that day on, none of us felt truly safe in that school, because whatever haunted those grounds was still there. We later learned that Jackson died just a few months after quitting the job. From what we heard, Jackson died a horrible and painful death. The burn-like scars on his face never healed, as if the thing had marked him forever. As for Peter and Daniel, they simply disappeared. No one ever heard of them again. Have you had any ghostly experience as a child? I remember one night from my childhood that still haunts me to this day. This happened when I was staying in the school hostel, and I was about 8 years old. Our dormitory was a massive hall, lined with nearly 100 beds, where all the students slept together. On one side, tall windows stretched across the wall, while the opposite side was filled with picture frames, paintings of angels, babies, Jesus Christ, and Mother Mary. At the front of the hall, on a small wall, was a shrine we always faced whenever we prayed. Every morning and every night, prayer was part of our strict routine. By 8 p.m., we had to be in bed. The lights would be switched off, leaving the dormitory in silence, except for a single dim night bulb. One night I lay awake, struggling to fall asleep. My mind kept racing with thoughts. I stared at the ceiling for a while, then turned my gaze toward the faintly lit wall of pictures. The night bulb hung right above a few of them, casting a pale yellow glow. At first, everything seemed normal, until I looked closer. One of the pictures, a painting of a smiling baby, suddenly appeared different. My heart skipped a beat when I realized what I was seeing. Tears rolling down its face. Only, they weren't ordinary tears. They were blood, thick red drops staining the smiling face of the baby in the frame. Terrified, I looked at another picture. This one showed a woman holding a child. But this time, the woman's painted expression changed. Slowly, her head turned, and she looked directly at me, smiling. Not a kind smile, but a creepy, unsettling grin that froze me to my core. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just a dream, just my imagination. But I was wide awake. Against every instinct, I slowly opened my eyes again, only to find the same horrifying sight waiting for me. The baby still wept blood. The woman still stared straight at me, smiling unnaturally. I darted my eyes across the wall, frame after frame. The same. Smiling faces, shifting eyes, and an overwhelming sense that something within those paintings was alive. Frozen with fear, I pulled the blanket over my head, turned toward the shrine at the front of the hall, and began praying silently, begging for protection. I was so terrified that I didn't dare leave the bed to go to the toilet. Somehow, through my trembling and prayers, I eventually fell asleep. When morning came, I remembered everything, every chilling detail. The following night, as bedtime approached, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. Whispering nervously, I told one of my friends what I had seen. His face turned pale, and in his fear, he began spreading the story to others. Within minutes, panic swept through the dormitory. Some boys screamed, others cried. Some ran around in terror, unable to calm down. The entire hall became chaos. And there I was, sitting silently in the middle of it all, knowing punishment was coming. Our warden stormed in, furious, screaming for silence. When the boys told her what I had said, the crying baby, the smiling woman, her anger turned on me. She grabbed me by the ear, dragged me out of the dormitory, and locked me out on the balcony. Her words cut deep. Now you'll stay here all night. Let the ghosts from outside come for you. And with that, she left me alone in the dark. The balcony overlooked the jungle surrounding the school. The wind howled through the trees, and every rustle, every crack of a branch made my heart pound harder. Shadows seemed to shift in the distance, and I was certain something was watching me. 2 hours passed in paralyzing fear before the warden finally returned. She unlocked the door, looked at me coldly, and said, "Now you've learned your lesson." Then she sent me back to bed. But even now I can still remember those paintings. The baby with blood tears, the woman smiling at me, as if they were alive. And to this day, I don't know if what I saw that night was just my imagination, or if something far darker truly lived within those walls. Have you ever wondered what happens when you disrespect the dead? What I'm about to share is a story from my teenage years, an experience that taught me never to cross that line again. I was around 16 years old. At that age, I was reckless, outspoken, and thought I was invincible. My friends were just like me, wild, carefree, and always looking for trouble. One night, our seniors invited us to a house party. Of course we went. We drank, we laughed, and we partied hard until past midnight. When it was finally time to leave, we faced a choice. Take the long, safe road, or the shortcut through dark fields, cliffs, and the cemetery beside the cathedral. Since we were drunk and wanted to avoid police patrols, we chose the shortcut. By the time we reached the graveyard, the alcohol had made us loud and fearless. My friend, Harry, suggested finishing our drinks right there, inside the cemetery. We each sat on a different grave, sipping, laughing, and joking. Deep inside, I knew it was wrong. It felt disrespectful. But I went along anyway, because I didn't want to be the only one to back down. That night, I remember only one thing clearly: a splitting headache before I passed out. The next morning, we all woke up with hangovers. But something was different. Harry, who initiated drinking at cemetery, looked nauseous, pale, and was complaining of stomach pain. Later that night, things got worse. One by one, we all began to fall sick. Headaches, dizziness, nausea. Then Harry collapsed, white foam oozing from his mouth. We panicked and rushed him to the hospital. By midnight, he was slipping in and out of consciousness. My friend John and I stayed behind to watch over him while the warden returned with the others. That's when things took a darker turn. As we sat in the hospital room, I noticed shadows moving across the wall near the toilet. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it happened again. John kept scratching his head, saying it felt like someone was tugging his hair. Then the water faucet in the toilet turned on by itself. We checked. No one was there. Still, we tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. Maybe pipes, maybe nerves. We turned off the lights and tried to sleep. But soon after, our sick friend, Harry, let out a piercing scream. We rushed to him. His entire bed was drenched in sweat, so much that his mattress was soaked through. The nurse dismissed it as a nightmare, but I knew deep down something else was going on. Days passed, and all of us who had been in the graveyard fell into a terrifying cycle. We'd get sick, feel better, then fall sick again. And then came the nightmares. We all had the same dream. We were back in the cemetery, only this time we weren't just drinking. We were feasting on rotten meat, crawling with flies, and drinking blood like liquid from golden cups. Strange, shadowy creatures surrounded us, laughing with us, urging us to eat more. When we woke, the dream felt too real. Some of us would wake up with scratches. Others would feel invisible hands pressing on their chest or their legs being lifted off the bed. We realized that we were being haunted. The final straw came one evening. We were sitting in the hostel room when mid-conversation, Harry suddenly fell to the floor. We laughed at first until he began sliding across the floor as if dragged by invisible hands. We screamed. He was pulled up against the wall and then, to our horror, lifted into the air. The lights flickered violently and shadows filled the room. We all saw it. There was no denying it anymore. Our warden burst in and froze at the sight, terrified. That night he made us pray, gave us each a Bible, and we slept in his room. The next morning, the warden called the principal, a priest we all called Father. The hostel warden told the principal what had happened the previous night. He listened quietly, then asked us one question. Did you do something you weren't supposed to do? We hesitated, but the weight of what had happened was too heavy. I admitted everything, that we had sat on the graves, drinking and mocking the dead. Father's face turned grim. Without a word, he took us to the chapel. There, he performed a cleansing ritual, sprinkling holy water and blessing each of us. Then he warned, never again disrespect the resting places of the dead. Some things are not meant to be disturbed. After the ritual, the strange events stopped. The sickness faded. The shadows disappeared. But the nightmares lingered. And from that day on, none of us, not one, ever dared to take that shortcut through the cemetery again. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Disrespect the dead, and they will make sure you regret it.